So welcome everyone. Thank you for being with us and not only being here, but being present, because that's very different. Today, we are actually going to be leaning in and honoring Juneteenth. And so with that being said, there's a lot that comes with Juneteenth. There's a lot that comes with what that actually means and how we can actually connect to that. And so what we're planning on doing today is giving a bit of a historical background, so a foundation so that we all have an understanding of what is the importance of Juneteenth, how does it connect to American history, and how is it connected and tethered to all of our shared experiences. The video that we're going to show after that is going to make things a little bit more personal. That's actually where we're going to get a chance to see a story, a narrative that is directly connected to how it has affected a family via Juneteenth, via the things that came from Juneteenth. And so after we go through that process, we're going to have a bit of a question and answer portion where if there's anything that you would like to ask, anything that you're curious about, we're going to be answering them to the best of our knowledge. And then we're going to shift gears, and the amazing Dr. Boston is going to walk us through a process where we're going to actually experience some of the things that we're talking about, and we're going to lean into more of an activity that can allow us to bring some of the light out, because we don't want to just necessarily focus on the negative aspects of this. We want to really make sure that we're honoring and celebrating the purpose of this day. And so how we're going to be ending is making sure that we're doing that. Dr. Boston is going to make sure that she walks us through that process. So that was a bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing today. I also want to make sure that you all know that this is going to be recorded. That's important for confidentiality purposes. So during that question and answer portion, if there's something that you would like to come on the screen or you would like to communicate, just know that this is recorded. So if you don't feel comfortable with your voice being on or your likeness being on the screen, that's something to keep in mind. We do have the chat function. So if there's anything that you would like to say at any point, just know that you can use the chat function. We're going to be monitoring that to make sure that if there's any technical issues, any questions that you have, that we'll be able to answer them. In terms of some housekeeping things, you all are actually doing an amazing job. We are going to invite you to keep your mic muted as well as your video off, just so that we can make sure there's no reverberation, and we can make sure that everyone is paying attention to the actual presentation and the process that we're going to be going through today. With that being said, I believe that that is all the housekeeping things. Team, did I miss anything that's really important or anything that you all would like to mention in that realm before we really get started?
I think you got it all. Thanks.
Awesome. And just a bit of background, so I don't want to take up too much time with like introductory stuff. But my name is Trent. I work for the Office of Human Rights and Equity as the Community Outreach Supervisor. And I have my amazing team with me as well as colleagues. And I don't want to like hold this space for them. So I actually want to shift gears. If each one of us wants to just to introduce ourselves or say anything that you would like to say about yourself. So right now on our team, we have Dr. Denise Boston, as well as Marla Moore. And then we also have some amazing peeps as well. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I didn't know if you wanted to also introduce yourselves.
I'm Denise Boston. I'm the Equity and Restorative Practices Manager in the Office of Human Rights and Equity. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Marla Moore. I'm an outreach coordinator, and it is my utmost pleasure to support Dr. Denise and Trent in this, what will be an amazing transformative experience. Thank you for showing up this afternoon, present and accounted for.
And just a thank you from the Office on Aging. I'm Jody Bargamian, and I'm joined by my coworker, Lucky Sohi. We are currently at the Elkridge 50 Plus Center as we gradually reopen the 50 Plus Center spaces. Thanks, guys, for being here.
Yes, beautiful, beautiful. So we have a team of amazing human beings and rock stars. So if there's anything that you would like to ask us, please, by all means, make sure you hit the chat. And so to just make sure that we're getting the ball rolling, as I stated before in the beginning when I talked about like the overview of today, where we're going to actually start is with a historical understanding so that we can have a baseline and a foundational understanding of what it is that we're actually talking about, why it's important to American history and not just African American history when we're talking about honoring Juneteenth, and why right now it seems like there's a lot more energy than there has been in the past years. And so with no further ado, I'm going to be muting myself and I'm going to put the history of Juneteenth on right now.
What is Juneteenth? Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day or Jubilee Day, is an African-American holiday that commemorates June 19th, 1865. That was the day that the last of the emancipated slaves were freed. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation as the nation approached its third year of civil war. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free.
Wait, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in January of 1863 and took over 2 years for the last of the slaves to be made free?
Yep, you got it. The country was still entrenched in a bloody war, which helped to slow communications. On top of that, many plantation owners kept the news from their slaves.
Well, at least now they were all free.
Well, not exactly. While yes, the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, technically slavery had not been abolished. Lincoln recognized that the proclamation needed to be followed by a constitutional amendment. Enter the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The necessary number of states to agree to the amendment was reached on December 6th, 1865.
And then they were free?
Yes, they were technically free, but the situation was a bit more complicated. You see, slavery was effectively abolished, except when used as a punishment for crime. Once slaves were freed, they weren't given any help with where to go and what to do. There was basically a large body of people with nowhere to go. Immediately, the former overseer force started arresting Black people for things such as vagrancy and trespassing on the only land they knew. Once convicted of these crimes, these freed slaves found themselves once again in bondage. To avoid being arrested for these crimes, some slaves made deals with their former masters, wherein they agreed to work the land, turning over a majority of the crops and profits to the owners in return for being allowed to live on the land. This tactic allowed plantation owners to keep their workforce and profit, while making sure that former slaves did not make enough money to start anything for themselves. As these former slaves continued to attempt to build something for themselves, they found ways to flourish and began to create the beginnings of a new future. In 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma's Greenwood district, known as Black Wall Street, was one of the most prosperous African-American communities in the United States. There were grocery stores, banks, barbershops. Some residents even owned their own planes. But on May 31st of that year, the Tulsa Tribune falsely reported that a Black man, Dick Rowland, attempted to rape a white woman, Sarah Page. As a result of the Tulsa Tribune's racially inflammatory report, Black and white armed mobs arrived at the courthouse. Scuffles broke out and shots were fired. 12 people were killed, 10 white and 2 Black. As news of these deaths spread throughout the city, mob violence exploded. White rioters rampaged through the Black neighborhood that night and morning, killing men and burning and looting stores and homes. Both politicians and the media falsely framed the Tulsa riot as an uprising started by lawless Blacks. The police disregarded due process, arresting Blacks and interning them in detention camps. Meanwhile, no whites were arrested. In just 16 hours, police had arrested 60% of the Black residents living in Black Wall Street. Mobs burned Black-owned businesses and homes and murdered hundreds of Black citizens. When Black men joined forces to protect their homes, they were ultimately driven out in fear for their lives. By today's estimates, the dreadful and murderous 16 hours cost more than $30 million in damages. The residents of Greenwood were blamed for the death and destruction, and the government made it nearly impossible to rebuild. During the 1950s and 1960s, there began an unprecedented movement for Black Americans to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. The Civil War had officially abolished slavery, but it didn't end discrimination against Black people. They continued to endure the devastating effects of racism, especially in the South. By the mid-20th century, Black Americans had had more than enough of prejudice and violence against them. They, along with many white Americans, mobilized and began an unprecedented fight for equality that spanned 2 decades. During the Civil Rights Movement, African Americans continued to push for their freedoms and rights, forming activist groups such as the Black Panther Party. The Panthers taught self-reliance and unity among all people while also standing in resistance against all oppressors. Like all of the other pro-Black institutions before them, the Panthers were discredited, disrupted, and systematically eliminated by racist policies, practices, and propaganda. Today's activism is more widespread than ever and takes many different forms as Black people and their allies continue to raise their voices within society. You can see people elevating the Black experience by openly celebrating their heritage through fashion, art, music, and even the natural hair movement. Black people are taking a stand and showing their history and culture are as integral and important as any other. Injustice is being addressed head-on, and it is coming from every corner of the Black community. It is being spotlighted by actors, athletes, musicians, and many more. One of the more recent waves of resistance is being led by the Black Lives Matter movement, which was started in 2013 by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. This organization was originally formed as a response when a young boy named Trayvon Martin was racially profiled, stalked, and murdered for the crime of wearing a hoodie and walking home while Black. His killer was acquitted using the controversial Stand Your Ground law, which has time and time again been used to justify the assault and murder of Black people, while seldom protecting their rights. A new movement was born, and you can see the effects today. So as you can see, we celebrate Juneteenth because it was the beginning of the future where Black people began their struggle for equal rights and treatment in the United States of America. Every Black person you see is an extension of those brave souls who had to carve out a place for themselves in this country.
Wow, that's incredible. I had no idea. How can I help?
Well, you can help by joining in and using your own voice to help affect change. You can sign petitions in support of various efforts to bring about equitable legislation that level the playing field for Black people. You can donate your money and time to organizations that effectively address the systemic racism in place against Black people. Most importantly, you can do the research on the candidates in your local and state elections and use the information to vote out officials who stand on inherently racist legislation and practices. Vote in progressive candidates who will champion a fair and equal treatment of Black people. Juneteenth is the celebration of the beginning of the first steps towards making Black people equal in this country. So on June 19th, don't be afraid to say, Happy Juneteenth.
All right, so very, very powerful video. And I love the way that it kind of goes through the entire process, like the timeline, and connects us to why it's still relevant for us to celebrate and for us to recognize how this piece of American history has contributed to the texture of our souls, has contributed to the texture of how we experience one another. And why some of these isms, some of these dignity violations continue to prevail. And so in order for us to understand something fundamental about our own humanity, we have to understand where we came from as a collective, all of us. I want to shift gears a little bit, and I do want to give kind of a bit of a disclaimer. So the next video that we're going to watch is way more personal. It's actually directly connected to a person's story and how their family experienced the beginning stages of Juneteenth and how they've walked through that process. It's also really important to show how it's connected to just an understanding of what Black Lives Matter actually means. Not necessarily a political statement, not even talking about an organization, simply the statement and why it's relevant and why people feel that it's something that needs to be communicated, because it hasn't been historically true. It hasn't been historically shown. So with no further ado, I'm going to show the next video. Second, sorry about that.
This is Hannah, who was purchased in the deep woods holding a mulatto baby at the age of 14 with a sign that said for sale around her neck.
Why did she have a for sale sign on?
She was being sold, possibly because she had been raped by a white master who caused her to have a mulatto baby, and maybe his wife didn't want her anymore. And when the Washington West family was attempting to cross the Mississippi from Tennessee to Texas, Mary Willauer West got down out of the wagon and told her husband, "I want you to buy that girl." And he took up a collection among the travelers, the wagon train travelers, to purchase Hannah in 1854 and settled in Sweet Home. This is my great-great-grandmother.
Do you know where they were on June 19th, 1865?
Yes, they were in Sweet Home, Texas.
Naomi Carrier celebrates Juneteenth because it's the day her great-great-grandmother, along with 300,000 other enslaved Black Texans, learned that they were free.
The day of the Jubilee they speak of, the day we're going to cross back over into Jordan, the day we're going to fly away. So they were anticipating freedom, and they knew that a logical outcome of the Civil War could mean freedom for African American slaves, whether they knew when it happened or not.
Juneteenth has taken on this kind of symbolic reverence as the day that the Emancipation Proclamation finally got to Texas. But in reality, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually end slavery, and neither did the Civil War. People did.
Juneteenth happened 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation that was scheduled to begin on January 1st, 1863 by Abraham Lincoln. But in Texas, the enslaved people were not allowed to practice their freedom until June 19th, 1865. And people will say, well, maybe they didn't get the news in time. Well, why were they late? They were late specifically because the planters needed to get another crop in the ground, and they did do that by Juneteenth. In fact, Abraham Lincoln had already been assassinated by the time the slaves in Texas were freed.
Yes, people in Texas knew about the Emancipation Proclamation, they just didn't enact it. They considered themselves a confederacy.
The Emancipation Proclamation was more about war strategy than about freeing the slaves. It was written during the Civil War and only applied to a subset of states that seceded from the Union. But the mere mention of emancipation, coupled with the invitation to join the Army, motivated almost 200,000 Black soldiers to join the Union and fight for their freedom on behalf of the Union, which forced equality to the forefront of the conversation. But Texas didn't care about that and wasn't interested in seceding.
The final vestiges of slavery were ended on June 19, 1865, but to what extent were they ended? Did he just come up and say, hi, everybody, we're here, slavery's over?
Hank Theory is a former board member of the Galveston Historical Foundation. He showed me how General Gordon Granger ended slavery in Texas with the help of 2,000 Union soldiers right here in Galveston.
Of course, everyone knew by the sheer number of troops, the port of Galveston had been captured. The majority of cotton from all the plantations in Texas came through this channel, this port. It made Galveston one of the wealthiest cities in Texas. The fact that all cotton coming through the Galveston port was quartermaster to Union control basically meant that it was over. The way the story is told, they left from this ship channel, roughly this general area, into downtown Galveston, where they entered the intersection of 22nd Street and the Strand. And that is when they began to issue their orders.
The day that General Gordon Granger came and delivered the announcement, and he didn't read the Emancipation Proclamation, he only read General Order Number 3.
General Order Number 3 doesn't have any caveats or clauses like the Emancipation Proclamation. And it doesn't just say that the enslaved people here are free, it says that they're equal.
What other document in American history discusses or references freed slaves as equal to their slave owners? You'd have to look long and hard to find it. It's applicable on June 19th, 1865. It's applicable on June 19th, 2020. It's the same message.
It's that clarity of language about the value of Black life that makes Juneteenth Emancipation Day. But our ability to live up to that ideal as a nation is best measured in the days, weeks, and years that followed. Gordon Granger makes this announcement. What can newly freed people do at this point?
Was it tough? Of course it was.
And so when that particular announcement came, slaves in Galveston and all through Texas City, League City, other small towns and cities coming north from Galveston began to leave a place where they felt there was no opportunity. They began to seek freedom.
When Black people were freed, they got nothing. You got no wagon, no horses, no land, no tools, and most of all, no education. You're looking at a Confederacy that doesn't want to yield and accept defeat. The military, who doesn't really have any real affinity for Black people, we're just ex-military. And then you're looking at the freed people who have to protect themselves from the awful violence that was prevalent against them at the end of the Civil War. In some ways, it might have been just like running away on the Underground Railroad.
And that was a trail of emancipation.
Earlier this year, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee co-authored a bill to start the process of making the Emancipation Trail a national park, documenting the pit stops, grave sites, neighborhoods, and towns where newly freed Black slaves, against unimaginable odds, made a way for themselves.
It tells the story of these freed slaves as they made their way through all those small cities into Freedmanstown, Independence Heights, the first African-American city, and then to Emancipation Park, right in Third Ward.
Watching the death of George Floyd, a Third Ward native, sparked nationwide ire over how we value Black lives as Americans. People who've never questioned whether or not our country is living up to the ideals that Gordon Granger spelled out on Juneteenth are questioning it now. And for Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, the Emancipation Trail is part of the answer. Why is it important that the Emancipation Trail be memorialized that way?
You know, I think the nation needs to cry. I think we need to weep. This looms very large in not our healing, but our transformation. It is crucial that we leap into another era, because the one thing that we're trying to cling to is freedom and human decency, and to be treated in a way that our life journey is not filled with human indecencies, and that Black lives not only matter, yes, they matter, we have to get others to know that, but that they are valued. Because if you don't value a life, you can take the life. So Black lives matter and should be valued.
All right. So thank you all for being present. At this time, I just want to open the floor if there are any questions or if anyone wants to make any comments, especially if this might have been connected to your own personal story or something that you want to share that you feel other people could learn from. I'm going to keep the space open. If no one has anything that they want to ask or put in the chat, and again, reminding us that this is being recorded, I'm going to shift gears to Dr. Boston so that she can walk us through the experiential process so that we can really solidify. And yes, I will share the links for the videos right now. And I think actually, Dr. Boston, I don't see any other questions besides the video. So I'm going to mute myself and take myself off camera.
Thank you, Trent. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. And this is kind of part 3 to honoring and making sure that we have an understanding of what Juneteenth is all about. So I'd like to do an activity with everyone based on what we just saw. And I'm asking everyone to get a piece of paper, pencils, color pencils, whatever you have at your disposal. It could be just an ink pen and a pencil and a piece of paper. And I would say 8 by 10 is a good size. And because we're going to do a creative kind of activity together in honor of our ancestors who went through that passage of time, and do something creative so that we will leave this day with something that we can hold on to, a tangible action that will help us to really understand our responsibility in understanding and celebrating Juneteenth as a culture and as a society. So I want to do an activity called the Laundry of Life. And the Laundry of Life is a creative narrative arts activity that generates new ways to approach cultural mindfulness practices and empathic social justice work. And it was created by a very good friend of mine. Her name is Dr. Shoshana Simons. She's an expressive arts therapist and practitioner, and came up with the Laundry of Life as a narrative, as a way to tell stories. And for this activity, I wanted to make it adaptable to us understanding the whole purpose of what Juneteenth is and how we can be empathic around this social justice work. The Laundry of Life uses an arts approach. We can do this with any generation to generate new storylines for addressing social problems facing groups and communities. So the laundry line is a metaphor of how do we clean, how do we cleanse the stains that are on our clothes, and the metaphor of a society that has gone through enslavement and the dehumanization of a whole population and a whole culture of people. And then the other side is, once we have an awareness of this history, once we have an awareness of how to cleanse the years of dehumanization and inequities and disparities, that we have a clothesline that's clean, that we have a process that will move us forward into being a more harmonious culture. So I wanted to focus on assessing intergenerational wisdom. You know, what does it mean to pass down knowledge to the next generation who's learning about Juneteenth, and to even generations of our elders who have known a little bit about it, but are really having an opportunity to look at the history that they have been a part of, and how do we reimagine justice as a culture, as a people, as a society. So how do we reimagine a world where Juneteenth does not exist again in our lifetime? So we're going to do a work around this. So everybody, please get out a piece of paper. And I want you to draw. I took a piece of paper here. I don't know if you see it, but you're going to use the whole sheet to draw an article of clothing. I drew like a dress with some buttons on it. So everybody take out a piece of paper, your paper that's in front of you, and draw. And you don't have to be an artist. Just draw either a pair of pants or shirt or skirt, the size of your 8 by 10 paper, because you need it to be big enough for you to write something on it. So I'll give you a second to, and if you could draw maybe 2 articles of clothing on 2 different pieces of paper, that would be great. So take the time to do that. And I have mine in front of me, and I'm going to do it along with you. And we're recording this. So when you happen to hear this as you're driving, you won't be able to really cut anything out or do anything physical. But I would love for you to have a mindset around imagining your article of clothing if you can't do it physically. Now, given the story of Juneteenth, and Trent showed us 2 amazing videos that brought light as to the historical aspects of this particular day and time, I want you to think of it as identifying the stains of life that we're left with as we look at the historical aspects of Juneteenth. Life challenges of African Americans in the United States, particularly the structural and institutional racism that has happened since enslavement. And write down on a separate sheet of paper or in the chat, let us know what are some of the challenges African Americans, and they gave it to you in the videos, that we have gone through since we have been, quote unquote, emancipated. I would say a challenge would be lynching had occurred when people were set free, and when they were caught on the street, when they were caught walking. Some other challenges have been unemployment. So write down several challenges that you have observed and witnessed that really relate to African Americans living in the United States 400 years later. So write down those structural and institutional. Not being able to vote is structural. The inability for people to have the right to buy homes in many different areas across the country when they were migrating. Difficulty in getting mortgages, being qualified. I can list almost so many inequities that have impacted the lives of African Americans, in my life too. I mean, I have, even with a degree, having the privilege of being a professor and a doctor has not eliminated me from the discrimination that I felt. So identifying the stains of life is the first process of us washing away these stains. I remember my mother had a washboard. It tells you how old I am. She scrubbed the stains out of clothing by hand. A lot of us did that when we did laundry. I had a grandmother that did laundry for white families, scrubbing out the stains. So how do we scrub out the lynching and all the stains that we know is part of the lived experiences of Africans living in America? Then the first washing cycle is a metaphor for hearing out these challenges. So in the chat, have you placed any of these challenges in the chat? So for all of us to hear what your perceptions of the challenges have been. Trent, can you see anything in the chat?
No, not at the moment. I don't see anything. But one of the things that I had on my list was passing on intergenerational wealth or holding on to intergenerational wealth. You're talking about the stain still?
Yeah, we're still talking about hearing about the challenges and the stains.
Yeah, so I had 3 so far. I had holding on to intergenerational wealth, living in resource rich or efficient spaces, and the internalized dynamic that comes with the war on drugs and how it was projected onto Black people in Black spaces.
Yes, and so a lot is very good. Thank you. And I hope that if you're out and about in the world listening to this, that you can identify what have been the challenges in your own families. You know, when you were sitting around the table and people would say negative things and racist comments about intermarriage is, you know, with people of African descent. And so how do we can't kind of eradicate the stains until we call all of them out. And internalized racism, as what Trent had said, is part of us holding on to a lot of our sense of inadequacies. Poor nutrition, yes. Living in food deserts is a stain. Mass incarceration, aversion to psychotherapy, yes. And so those things continue to have an impact on our lives because we're still not healed as Africans living in America. So how do we start to rinse the cycle? What's the rinse cycle look like? So immersing these challenges in the cleansing wisdom of waters to wash out hate and racism and discrimination. So I want you to think about the metaphor of how do we individually and collectively begin to eradicate racism and hate and discrimination. And we're talking more specifically with Africans living in America. And so what I would love for you to do on those wonderful pieces of clothing that you have is to place words of wisdom on your clothes. You know, what can we do more tangibly, each of us, to make sure that we are not going to replicate discrimination and hatred and racism with people who are African descendants? How does Black Lives Matter for us in the way that we start to talk and start to live in solidarity? And so on my clothing, I put kindness is liberating. So what are words of wisdom? Kindness to one another is liberating. There's no equity without solidarity. Other words of wisdom. Remember when your grandmother would say just a few words, you know, be careful what you say. My grandmother would say, be careful with your words. It wasn't like a whole paragraph. It was just 3 or 4 words that helped me understand that before I speak, be mindful of what I'm about to say. So creating a world based in justice and compassion is liberating. So if you can think of the wise words that can begin to cleanse all of the stains that we have, all of us in this country have been privy to in the ways in which we treat people of African descent. And then we're going to hang our clothes up. When I do this workshop and when I've seen this workshop done, we cut out the images of these clothes, and it's just like on the clothesline. We hang them up all around the room so people can see the wisdom of how we're going to move forward together. And we have an understanding of this is a collective act. And then you start to swipe wonderful wisdom words with one another, so that whatever someone else created, I'm going to use that as a value of my own life. So I saw Trent coming on board. So Trent, what are some of the wisdom words that you came up with? Marla, if you want to chime in, if we don't have anything in the chat, what are some of the wise words that can help us understand that how we live our lives is the values that we're going to start to hold?
So the ones that I have, I drew a hoodie and then I put my stuff on. And so the ones that I have, and the reason why I did a hoodie is I really enjoy wearing hoodies. They make me feel secure. And I feel like it is a statement of being like unapologetically Black. And like, that's actually what I put on the pocket. So these are reminders for myself of how I need to lean into this. So I oftentimes go in a lot of different spaces, and code switching can sometimes be a little weird. And so being unapologetically Black is a reminder that I need to have within myself, that it's okay, regardless of where I'm at, to be myself, to exist within my culture, and to not feel slighted or less than. I have on the sleeve compassion, and then on the opposite sleeve, I have fiery passion, because I think that both are very important. And I think that if you don't allow yourself to exist within your passion, even when you're being compassionate, that you can undermine your own reality. And I've unfortunately done that before. In the middle of my chest, I have know thyself. And so like where the hood is, it actually is like a cycle, like a cycle that goes through. And so it says focused, grace, rooted, and then that equals knowing thyself. And those are all the things that I have on mine. And then here's a picture if you're curious.
That's lovely. I'd like to just close with a closing line, as that's a great metaphor to continue to use it. And then we'll open it up so that folks can have a chance to ask any questions or any final remarks before we leave for today. And regardless of what else that you put on, wear it with love. You know, make sure that we're walking with an intention of erasing the harm, we're walking with the intention of eradicating racism and discrimination. And we can't just leave it to the larger society. We have to take this on ourselves. So as I am teaching and as I am leading, my value system is about eradicating all the harm that has happened to people that look like me. I'm an African-American woman, an elder who's been here for a while. I've seen a lot. And I know that for me, it's important for me to pass on to my children and my grandchildren what it means to be liberated, what it means to walk with a sense of pride, even in the midst of a lot of hate and inequities and disparities. And so with that said, I just want to say on my clothesline, thank you for doing this exercise. And this exercise can be done in your homes with your family. It's a great exercise for a summer camp. You have people over at your house for any kind of engagement. Place out paper on the table and you can really wash away a lot of the inequities that we are experiencing just in the privacy of your own home. You can do this wonderful work. So I will stop sharing and then we can open it up.
Thank you, Denise. That was amazing. I really appreciate us being able to essentially just move into something that's genuinely connected to our history, as well as knowing it intuitively in our body. So the process that you walked us through of like just being experiential, I hope resonated with everyone. I hope that you take the opportunity to really try this on, to lean into this so that you can have a better understanding of not only yourself, but how we can collectively work together, how we can collectively honor each other. So at this time, we have a little bit of extra time if there are any questions or anything like that, but this is the end of our program and we don't have anything else that we specifically want to do or need to do for you. But if there are any questions or anything that you would like us to respond to specifically based off of the things that we shared, this would be the perfect timing. Also, Lucky and Jody, if there's anything that you also would like to share with the group, or if there's anything that you'd like to comment on, this would be an amazing time to do that as well.
Thank you to everyone. The process of reflective thinking, Dr. Boston, I really like that concept, and I think sometimes it takes a minute to slow down and have some guidance with that. In this world today, I think we're jumping from one thing to the next, and whether we're hit with news, TV, social media all over the place, but I really appreciate the process of taking a moment and breaking it down. I found that very valuable. Thank you.
Hi, it's Lucky. I was going to say, as usual, it's a great program, a great reminder, an important component in the history of this country, one we shouldn't forget. And I'm so glad that the county's celebrating it formally this year. And yeah, as always, a great program.
Yes, definitely. And just to put things into perspective, last year, the first time that our office had an opportunity to do something for Juneteenth, we actually had the opportunity to work with Lucky. And so knowing that things are starting to change, it's just really beautiful that, just like we said before, there are things that we can do on an individual level, things that we can do to lean into to make sure that we're honoring each other. I just wanted to make sure that we honored Lucky for that, because I don't know if we would be here right now if that wouldn't have happened last year.
You would. You guys would. You're a great team, and we're lucky to be working with you. That's for sure.
Beautifully said, beautifully said. All right, everyone. So at this time, I would say that we could probably end the recording unless someone has something that's really pressing. And I know that I'll stay on until 1 o'clock, just in case anyone has any questions or wants to ask anything about the Office of Human Rights and Equity just in general. But other than that, thank you for being here. And I guess I'll put myself on camera. I really appreciate you all being present. And I know that everyone that presented today and all of my colleagues also thank you. Please be well, be kind to yourself, and be kind to others. Have an amazing day.